He's planning to serve me divorce papers at my 40th birthday party tomorrow, but my lawyer's call 3 hours ago just made me the beneficiary of his mother's $12 million estate. 12 years of marriage teaches you a lot about timing, when to smile, when to stay silent, and exactly how long it takes to completely destroy someone who underestimated you. As I sit here in our marble-floored kitchen, carefully addressing invitations to tomorrow's surprise birthday celebration, I can't help but smile at the irony. Damien thinks he's orchestrating the perfect public humiliation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Divorce papers disguised as a birthday gift, delivered in front of our closest friends and family. What he doesn't know is that while he's been planning my social execution, I've been planning his financial annihilation. The call came at 3:47 p.m. today. Margaret Whitmore, senior partner at Whitmore and Associates, her voice crisp and professional. Mrs. Coleman, I have some unexpected news regarding your late mother-in-law's estate. There's been a development that changes everything. Helena Coleman had always despised me. For 12 years, she made it clear that her precious son Damien had married beneath his station. The ice-cold stares at family dinners, the backhanded compliments about my quaint background, the way she'd introduce me as Damien's wife, rather than using my name, Delilah. But Helena was also brilliant, calculating, and apparently she'd been watching our marriage far more closely than anyone realized. The beauty of my situation isn't just that Damien picked the wrong day to destroy me. It's that he has absolutely no idea what's coming. Right now, he's probably in his study, practicing his speech in the mirror, perfecting that concerned husband expression he'll wear when he reluctantly admits our marriage is over. He's always been theatrical, my husband. A corporate attorney who treats every conversation like a closing argument. But Damien made one critical error in his timing. He chose to end our marriage exactly 24 hours after his mother's will was read. And Helena, vindictive even in death, had apparently been planning her own surprise for quite some time. Your mother-in-law amended her will 6 months ago, Margaret had explained, her voice betraying nothing. She left very specific instructions: the entire estate, the mansion, the investment portfolio, the family business shares. Everything goes to you, Mrs. Coleman, not her son. You. $12 million, the Coleman family fortune, built over 3 generations, now legally mine. Helena's final act of maternal love, or her ultimate punishment for the son who disappointed her one too many times? I'm not sure it matters anymore. Damien and I met at Northwestern, both law students grinding through contracts and constitutional law. He was charismatic, ambitious, devastatingly handsome in that preppy way that screams old money and newer privilege. I was the scholarship kid from Cicero, working 2 jobs to pay for textbooks, studying in 24-hour diners because my apartment was too noisy. He pursued me with the same methodical precision he'd later bring to his corporate mergers. Flowers every Tuesday, dinner at progressively more expensive restaurants, weekend trips to his family's lake house in Wisconsin. I fell hard and fast, seduced by his confidence and the promise of a life I'd only seen in movies. The proposal came. During our 3rd year, a flawless 2-carat diamond presented at the same restaurant where we'd had our first date. "You complete me, Delilah," he'd said, and I believed him completely. What I didn't understand then was that Damien collected beautiful things: art, watches, wines, wives, and the thrill was always in the acquisition, never the ownership. The cracks started small: forgotten anniversaries, canceled dinner plans, phone calls he'd take in another room, speaking in low, urgent tones. When I'd ask, he'd smile that practiced lawyer smile and cite client confidentiality. "You know how it is, babe. High-stakes mergers wait for no one." But Damien got sloppy. 3 months ago, I found the credit card statements he'd forgotten to hide. Charges at hotels I'd never seen, restaurants we'd never visited together, a jewelry store purchase for $3,200 on a Tuesday afternoon when he'd told me he was in depositions. All day. The private investigator I hired was embarrassingly thorough. Photos, timeline, bank records. Damien wasn't just having an affair, he was systematically preparing for our divorce. Moving assets, consulting attorneys, building a narrative that would paint me as the unstable wife who'd become a liability to his career advancement. The most devastating discovery wasn't the infidelity, it was the identity of his accomplice. Roxanne, my younger sister, my maid of honor, the person I'd confided in about every doubt and fear in my marriage. The investigator's photos showed them together at the Ritz-Carlton, her hand on his chest, his mouth against her ear, sharing secrets I was never meant to know. Roxanne had always been the pretty one, the charming one, the sister who got whatever she wanted by batting her eyelashes and tilting her head just so. Growing up, she'd borrowed my clothes, copied my homework, and somehow made it seem like she was doing me the favor. When I got into Northwestern, she suddenly developed an interest in law. When I started dating Damien, she began showing up at our study group sessions, always perfectly dressed, always asking the right questions. I should have seen it coming. Roxanne never wanted what I had. She wanted what she thought she deserved, which was everything I had, but better. And Damien, susceptible to admiration and practiced at compartmentalizing, was exactly the kind of conquest that would appeal to her competitive nature. But here's what neither Damien nor Roxanne anticipated. Helena Coleman's final chess move. Tomorrow night, as Damien stands in our living room surrounded by our friends and family, preparing to humiliate me with divorce papers disguised as a birthday surprise, I'll have something much more devastating to share. The inheritance documents are already filed. The bank accounts have been notified. The family business shares have been transferred. By the time Damien realizes what's happened, I'll own everything he thought he was entitled to inherit. The Coleman legacy, the financial security he's counted on, the cushion that made his affair feel risk-free. All of it now belongs to the wife he's planning to discard. Margaret had smiled when she handed me the documents this afternoon. Your mother-in-law left a note, she'd said, producing a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Helena's precise script. She wanted you to have this before tomorrow. Inside, Helena's final message. Delilah, you were the daughter I never had and the wife my son never deserved. Don't let him destroy you. Use this gift to destroy him instead. With love and respect, Helena. Tomorrow night, when Damien thinks he's delivering the ultimate surprise, he'll discover that some surprises cut both ways. And 12 years of marriage has taught me exactly how to time the perfect counterstrike. 12 years of being married to a corporate attorney teaches you things they don't cover in law school. You learn to read the micro-expressions that precede a lie, to recognize the difference between genuine affection and calculated performance. And most importantly, you learn that the most devastating legal strategies aren't found in textbooks. They're born from intimate knowledge of your opponent's weaknesses. When I married Damien, I thought I was gaining a partner. What I actually acquired was a front-row seat to the education of a lifetime. Corporate law isn't just about contracts and mergers. It's about human psychology, strategic timing, and the art of making your opponent believe they're winning right, up until the moment they lose everything. Damien never bothered to hide his work from me. Why would he? I was just the wife, the beautiful accessory who looked perfect at firm parties and asked appropriately impressed questions about his cases. He'd spread files across our dining room table, take calls on speaker while I cooked dinner, practice his opening statements while I folded laundry. For 12 years, I absorbed every strategy, every tactic, every psychological manipulation technique that made him one of Chicago's most feared corporate attorneys. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The key to any successful negotiation, he'd tell his junior associates during the dinner parties we'd host, is controlling the narrative. Make them react to your timeline, your revelations, your surprises. The moment you're responding to their moves instead of executing your own plan, you've already lost. I'd smile and refill wine glasses, playing the perfect hostess while mentally cataloging every word. Damien had no idea he was training his own downfall. The irony is almost poetic. He taught me that the most effective attacks come from positions of apparent weakness, that the best revenge isn't emotional, it's methodical, that timing isn't just important, it's everything. And most crucially, that the person who controls the flow of information controls the outcome of any conflict. Helena Coleman had been watching me learn these lessons. During those excruciating family dinners where she'd dissect every aspect of my background and breeding, I thought she was testing whether I was worthy of her son. Now I realize she was evaluating whether I was strong enough to survive him. Marriage, she'd told me once, during a rare moment of vulnerability after her third glass of wine, is a business partnership disguised as a love story. The successful wives are the ones who remember that when the love story ends, the business partnership still has assets to divide. At the time, I'd thought she was being cynical. Now I understand she was being strategic. The months of private investigation taught me something else. Patience is a weapon. While Damien rushed toward his affair with my sister, making increasingly careless mistakes, I moved with surgical precision. Every piece of evidence was documented, verified, and legally protected. Every financial record was copied and stored in multiple locations. Every conversation was mentally recorded and time-stamped. But the real education came from watching him operate in his professional life. Damien's specialty was hostile takeovers, identifying companies vulnerable to acquisition, exploiting their weaknesses, and dismantling them piece by piece. His success came from understanding that the most devastating attacks appear to come from nowhere, even though they've been planned for months or years. Due diligence, he'd explain to clients, isn't just about understanding the target company's assets. It's about understanding their blind spots, their assumptions, their unquestioned beliefs about their own security. The best takeovers feel like surprises, but they're actually the result of meticulous preparation. He never imagined I was applying his own methodology to our marriage. I learned to compartmentalize emotions from strategy, exactly as he'd taught me by example. When I discovered his affair with Roxanne, my first instinct was confrontation. Tears, accusations, dramatic ultimatums. But 12 years of watching Damien work had taught me that emotional responses are tactical errors. They reveal your position, limit your options, and give your opponent time to prepare counter-strategies. Instead, I treated the discovery like Damien would treat an advantageous piece of intelligence, as ammunition to be deployed at the optimal moment for maximum effect. The private investigator, Jack Morrison, was someone Damien had used for corporate cases, a detail that amused me greatly. When I hired Jack to document my husband's infidelity, I was literally using Damien's own resources against him. Jack understood discretion, legal admissibility, and the importance of building an airtight case before making any moves. Your husband's good, Jack had told me after our third meeting, sliding a manila envelope across the coffee shop table. But he's operating like he's untouchable. That's when people get sloppy. The envelope contained 3 months of documentation. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, parking garage timestamps, phone records, and photographs that painted a comprehensive picture of Damien and Roxanne's affair. But more importantly, it contained evidence of Damien's financial preparations for divorce, asset transfers, consultation fees paid to matrimonial attorneys, and retainer agreements that revealed the scope of his planning. He's been strategizing this for at least 6 months, Jack explained. Moving money, building narratives, positioning himself for what he thinks will be a quick, clean break. He's treating this like a corporate restructuring: minimize losses, control the messaging, and move on to the next acquisition. That's when I realized Damien had made his fatal error. He was planning a hostile takeover of our marriage, but he'd forgotten the first rule of due diligence. Always assume your target is more sophisticated than they appear. Helena's inheritance wasn't just a financial windfall. It was the perfect validation of every strategic lesson her son had unknowingly taught me. Tomorrow night, when Damien attempts to execute his carefully orchestrated surprise, he'll discover that while he was learning to be a better attorney, I was learning to be a better adversary. The student, as they say, had become the master. And the master was about to learn what happens when you underestimate someone who's been taking notes for 12 years. I wasn't supposed to find the birthday party planning documents. Isn't that how these stories always begin? An innocent search for something mundane, a door left slightly ajar, a moment of curiosity that shatters your entire world and rebuilds it into something unrecognizable. It was 3 weeks ago, a rainy Thursday morning in early March. Damien had left for his morning, run the same 5-mile route through Lincoln Park he'd been taking for 8 years, as predictable as clockwork. I was looking for our tax documents, specifically the charitable contribution receipts we'd need for our accountant. Damien always kept them in his home office filing cabinet, organized with the same obsessive precision he brought to his legal cases. The filing cabinet was locked, which wasn't unusual. Damien maintained attorney-client privilege even at home, keeping sensitive case documents secure. But the small brass key was exactly where it had always been, taped under the lip of his eye. Desk drawer, a hiding spot so obvious it was almost endearing in its predictability. I found the tax documents in the second drawer, neatly arranged in manila folders labeled by year and category. But as I reached for the 2023 charitable contributions file, my fingers brushed against something unexpected. A folder that didn't belong in the tax section, labeled simply D&D in Damien's precise handwriting. D&D. Damien and Delilah. Our initials. The monogram we'd used on our wedding invitations. The cute abbreviation he'd used in text messages during our early dating years. Curiosity, that fatal human flaw, made me pull the folder from its hiding place. The first document was a timeline, printed on Damien's law firm letterhead titled Project D&D Implementation Schedule. My hands didn't shake as I read it, which surprised me. 12 years of marriage had apparently prepared me for this moment in ways I hadn't expected. March 15th. Final asset verification complete. March 20th. Consultation with Stevens & Associates. Matrimonial law. March 25th. Narrative documentation finalized April 1st. Birthday party execution. April 2nd. Formal filing. April 15th. Media strategy implementation. My birthday. April 1st. April Fool's Day. A detail that felt like cosmic mockery. Damien was planning to serve me divorce papers at my own birthday party, treating the dissolution of our marriage like just another corporate project to be managed and executed. But the timeline was just the beginning. Beneath it lay months of meticulous planning that revealed the true scope of Damien's betrayal. Bank statements showing systematic asset transfers, legal consultations dating back to December, character assessments and behavioral observations written in the clinical language of a psychological evaluation. Subject exhibits increasing emotional instability, one document noted. Documented instances of social anxiety, financial irresponsibility, and inappropriate responses to family obligations. Building case for contested divorce based on incompatibility and subject's inability to maintain professional social standards required for advancement. Subject, he was referring to me, his wife of 12 years, as a subject in a legal case study. Every argument we'd had, every moment of vulnerability I'd shared, Every human emotion I'd expressed had been cataloged and weaponized for his divorce strategy. The financial documents were equally devastating. Damien had been moving money for months, transferring funds to accounts I didn't know existed, liquidating investments without my knowledge, and building a financial fortress designed to leave me with as little as possible. Our joint savings account, which I thought contained nearly $200,000, actually held less than $30,000. The rest had been legitimately moved to cover business expenses and investment opportunities that would somehow prove difficult to trace during divorce proceedings. But the most damaging document was a psychological profile, apparently compiled with the help of a private consultant, analyzing my behavioral patterns and emotional vulnerabilities. It read like a prosecutor's opening statement against someone accused of being an unfit wife. Subject demonstrates consistent pattern of social inadequacy in professional settings. Former waitress background creates ongoing discomfort in corporate social environments. Lacks sophistication required for advancement in high-level legal circles. Emotional responses often inappropriate for public settings. Relationship with family of origin suggests working-class values incompatible with client's professional trajectory. Every insecurity I'd ever shared with him in private moments, every confession about feeling out of place at firm parties, every admission of imposter syndrome had been collected and compiled into evidence against me. The man I'd trusted with my deepest fears had turned them into ammunition for my destruction. The final section contained what Damien called the April 1st Protocol, a detailed script for how he planned to end our marriage. He would wait until the birthday cake was served, when everyone was relaxed and celebrating. Then he'd stand up, ostensibly to make a toast in my honor, and instead deliver a carefully rehearsed speech about how sometimes loving someone means letting them go. "Ladies and gentlemen," the script began, "Delilah and I have been keeping something from you that we can no longer hide. Our marriage, while it's brought us both tremendous growth, has reached its natural conclusion. We've decided to divorce, and we wanted to share this news with the people we love most on a day that represents new beginnings for Delilah." The speech continued for 3 pages, each paragraph calculated to paint their divorce as a mutual decision born from love and respect. But the final paragraph revealed the true malice behind the performance. "We ask for your understanding and support as we both move forward. Delilah will be taking some time to rediscover herself and explore new opportunities, while I'll be focusing on the next phase of my career, which will require the kind of focus and dedication that our marriage, unfortunately, no longer allows." Translation: I was being discarded for being insufficiently ambitious, publicly humiliated for lacking the sophisticated background he now found embarrassing, and financially abandoned because he'd found something better. But there was one more. Document in the folder, one that transformed my horror into something far more dangerous. Rage. It was a hotel receipt from the Ritz-Carlton, dated 3 days earlier, for a suite registered under the name Mr. and Mrs. Coleman. Below it, a handwritten note in Damien's script. "R loves the champagne. She'll make a perfect partner for the next phase. R. Roxanne." My sister wasn't just an affair. She was my replacement, already being auditioned for the role of the next Mrs. Coleman. The same sister who'd called me 2 days ago, asking what she should wear to my birthday party, what gift would be most meaningful, how excited she was to celebrate another year of my wonderful marriage. I sat in Damien's leather chair, surrounded by the evidence of his systematic dismantling of our life together, and felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't just betrayal, it was attempted annihilation. He wasn't just leaving me. He was trying to erase me, to rewrite our entire history as a mistake he'd finally corrected. But Damien had made one critical error in his meticulous planning. He'd assumed I would react like the subject in his psychological profile, emotional, devastated, easily manipulated. He'd underestimated the woman he'd been married to for 12 years, the woman who'd been watching him operate, learning his methods, absorbing his strategies. As I carefully returned each document to its place in the folder, ensuring everything appeared untouched, I realized that Damien had just handed me the blueprint for his own destruction. He'd shown me exactly when, where, and how he planned to destroy me. Now I could plan accordingly. The depth of Damien's betrayal revealed itself slowly, like poison seeping through a carefully constructed dam. Each document in that folder represented months of calculated deception, but it was the handwritten notes in the margins that truly broke my heart. Personal observations about my shortcomings, written in the same careful script he'd used to write love letters during our engagement. "D still doesn't understand wine pairings. Embarrassing at Morrison client dinner," read one note, dated 6 months ago. I remembered that dinner clearly. I'd asked the sommelier for a recommendation instead of pretending to know which vintage complimented the sea bass, and Damien had smiled encouragingly at the time. Apparently, behind that smile, he was cataloging my social inadequacies for future use. The financial documents told their own story of systematic theft disguised as investment strategy. Our joint portfolio, which I'd believed was growing steadily, had been carefully dismantled starting in January. The $50,000 withdrawal for emerging market opportunities had actually funded his retainer for Stevens & Associates, the city's most aggressive matrimonial law firm. The $75,000 real estate investment had purchased a downtown condo that I discovered was already listed under his name alone. But the most devastating revelation was the prenuptial agreement amendment, drafted 3 months ago and never shown to me. Damien had prepared a document claiming that I'd agreed to a lifestyle modification clause that would limit my alimony to 2 years and exclude me from any business assets acquired during our marriage. My signature had been expertly forged, using samples from our joint tax returns. The psychological profile continued for 15 pages, dissecting 12 years of marriage with clinical precision. Every private conversation we'd had about my background, every moment of vulnerability I'd shared about feeling out of place in his world, every confession about my insecurities had been transformed into evidence of my unfitness as a corporate wife. Subjects' working-class origins become increasingly apparent under social pressure, one section noted. Language patterns revert to regional dialect when stressed. Table manners adequate but not instinctive. Wardrobe choices require constant supervision. Overall presentation inconsistent with advancement to senior partner level. Senior partner. The promotion he'd been chasing for 3 years. The career pinnacle that apparently required a wife upgrade. I wasn't being divorced. I was being traded in for a newer model that better matched his professional aspirations. The timeline revealed the mathematical precision of his planning. Every major decision in our marriage over the past year had been calculated to support his exit strategy. The vacation to Tuscany that I'd thought was a romantic second honeymoon had actually been timed to keep me out of the country while he finalized asset transfers. The marriage counseling sessions he'd suggested, which I'd seen as a hopeful sign, had provided him with professional documentation of our irreconcilable differences. Even my birthday party, the event I'd been planning for months, excited to celebrate with friends we'd made together, had been strategically designed as the stage for my public humiliation. The guest list, which Damien had insisted on reviewing, included his law firm partners, key clients, and influential contacts who would serve as witnesses to his reluctant decision to end our marriage. The invitation wording, which I'd thought was sweetly romantic, now revealed its true purpose. Join us in celebrating Delilah as she enters a new decade of life and new possibilities. He'd literally embedded the divorce announcement in the party invitation, priming our guests to see my 40th birthday as a transition point rather than a celebration. But it was the communication logs that truly shattered any remaining illusions about our marriage. Damien had been documenting our private conversations for months, recording not just what I said, but how I said it, looking for evidence of emotional instability or unreasonable behavior. Intimate moments I'd cherished, late-night talks about our future, vulnerable discussions about our families, quiet confessions about my fears and dreams, had been reduced to bullet points in his legal strategy. Dee expressed concern about never having children, evidence of ongoing resentment. Read one entry from a conversation I remembered fondly. We'd been lying in bed after making love, and I'd mentioned wondering what our kids might have looked like. He'd kissed my forehead and said we still had time to decide. I'd felt closer to him in that moment than I had in years. He'd been taking notes. The Stevens and Associates consultation notes were equally brutal. His matrimonial attorney had recommended a rapid deployment strategy designed to minimize my ability to mount an effective defense. Serve papers publicly to create social pressure for a quick settlement. Flood me with documentation to overwhelm my emotional state. Present the divorce as a fait accompli rather than a negotiation. Client's wife lacks legal sophistication and financial resources for extended litigation, the notes concluded. Recommend aggressive timeline to secure favorable terms before subject can organize effective response. They were counting on me being too heartbroken, too humiliated, and too poor to fight back. They'd underestimated my capacity for strategic thinking, but more importantly, they'd underestimated how thoroughly Damien had educated me in the art of legal warfare. The affair documentation was the final insult. Hotel receipts dating back 4 months, always charged to his business account as client entertainment. Restaurant bills for intimate dinners at places we'd never been together. Jewelry purchases that had never appeared on my dresser. And photos. Dozens. Of photos that painted a picture of a relationship that had been developing in parallel to our marriage. Roxanne looked radiant in every image, her photographer's eye evident in the carefully composed shots. She'd always been beautiful, but in these photos, she glowed with the confidence of a woman who knew she was winning. The same sister who'd been texting me regularly, asking about my marriage, offering to help with party planning, expressing concern about my obvious unhappiness with such convincing sincerity. The final document in the folder was a lease agreement for a penthouse apartment in River North, signed by both Damien and Roxanne 3 weeks ago. They weren't just having an affair. They were already building a life together, planning their future while systematically dismantling mine. But the most damning evidence was a handwritten letter from Roxanne to Damien, tucked between the legal documents like a love note in a textbook. Her familiar handwriting covered 2 pages of expensive stationery. My darling Dee, I can't wait until this charade is over and we can finally be together publicly. Watching you pretend to love her these past months has been torture, but I know it's necessary. She's always been so naive, so trusting. She has no idea what's coming. By this time next month, we'll be free to start our real life together. Thank you for choosing me over her. Thank you for seeing what she could never be. I love you completely. Forever yours are. The letter was dated 2 days ago. While I'd been discussing flower arrangements and menu options for my birthday party, my sister had been writing love letters to my husband about their shared future and my impending destruction. Sitting in Damien's office, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal, I realized that this wasn't just about ending our marriage. This was about erasing me entirely, financially, socially, and emotionally. They wanted to rewrite history so completely that my 12 years with Damien would become nothing more than an embarrassing mistake he'd finally corrected. But as I carefully photographed each document with my phone, ensuring I had copies of every piece of evidence, I felt something settle in my chest. They'd planned my destruction with such meticulous care, such attention to detail, such absolute confidence in my helplessness. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been about everything. The 3 weeks following my discovery were a masterclass in self-control and strategic observation. Every morning, I woke up next to a man who was actively planning my destruction, smiled at him over coffee, and asked about his day with the same loving concern I'd shown for 12 years. The performance required a level of emotional compartmentalization that I hadn't known I possessed. But Damien had taught me well. In corporate litigation, he'd always emphasized the importance of maintaining normal operations while building your case. Never let them know you know, he'd tell his associates. The moment they realize you're onto them, they'll change their behavior, destroy evidence, or accelerate their timeline. Patience is a weapon. So I watched, and learned, and documented. Everything. Damien's patterns became transparently obvious once I knew what to look for. The late meetings that happened every Tuesday and Thursday weren't at his office. They were at Roxanne's photography studio in Wicker Park. I'd drive by sometimes on my way to grocery shopping, parking across the street to watch him emerge from her building with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he was getting away with everything. His phone behavior was equally telling. Damien had always been protective of his device, citing attorney-client privilege, but now I noticed the subtle changes. The way he'd flip it face down when I entered the room. The slight smile that would cross his face when certain notifications arrived. The way he'd excuse himself to the bathroom to respond to texts, returning with barely concealed excitement. One evening, while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed with a message from R Photography, Roxanne's professional contact listing. The preview on his lock screen read, "Can't wait for tomorrow night. I have something special planned for after the party. You're going to love your surprise." Tomorrow night was my birthday party. They were planning their own private celebration for after my public humiliation. I began timing his routines with forensic precision. His morning run was exactly 43 minutes, always the same route, always ending with the same post-workout smoothie. His evening document review sessions in his home office lasted between 90 minutes and 2 hours, but I could hear him on the phone for at least half that time, his voice taking on the intimate tone I remembered from our early courtship. The most revealing moments came during his interactions with Roxanne in public. My sister had always been tactile, hugging everyone, touching arms during conversation, standing closer than strictly necessary. But now I watched for the micro-expressions, the barely perceptible moments of intimacy that spoke of a relationship far beyond family friendship. At our cousin's engagement party 2 weeks ago, I observed them together with new eyes. Roxanne wore a red dress that was stunning but inappropriate for a family event, the kind of outfit that demanded attention and got it. Damien's eyes found her repeatedly throughout the evening, and when she laughed at his jokes, his smile was different, hungrier, more possessive. They were careful not to stand together for too long or speak privately where others could see, but they'd developed a language of glances and subtle gestures. When Roxanne touched her neck, Damien would excuse himself for a drink. When he adjusted his tie, she'd head toward the restroom. They were coordinating their movements like dancers, who'd rehearsed the choreography. The most damning observation came during a family dinner at my parents' house. Roxanne had volunteered to help my mother in the kitchen, playing the role of the devoted daughter while I sat in the living room with Damien and my father. Through the kitchen doorway, I watched her photograph our mother's famous lasagna recipe with professional precision. "For my portfolio," she explained when I asked. "I'm expanding into food photography." But later, when she thought no one was looking, I saw her text the photos to someone. The recipient's name flashed briefly on her screen. Future husband. She was already collecting pieces of our family history, appropriating our traditions, for her new life with my husband. Damien's behavior at home became increasingly careless as the party date approached. He'd disappear into his office for urgent calls that lasted hours, emerging with the flushed excitement of a man planning something thrilling. He'd started working out more intensively, updating his wardrobe, and paying attention to grooming details he'd ignored for years. "I want to look good for your party," he'd say, admiring himself in our bedroom mirror. "This is going to be such an important night." The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. He was preparing for my birthday party with the same enthusiasm most men, reserved for their own wedding day. And in a way, it was exactly that, the beginning of his new life and the death of our old one. I started documenting his lies with systematic precision. Every client dinner that was actually a date with Roxanne. Every weekend case review that coincided with her photography workshops out of town. Every conference call that happened while she was posting Instagram stories from restaurants. I recognized the financial surveillance was equally revealing. Damien had become sloppy with his asset hiding, probably because he assumed I'd never think to look. Credit card statements showed a pattern of purchases that told the story of a man courting someone new. Jewelry from boutiques I'd never visited. Lingerie from designers I didn't recognize. Flowers delivered to addresses that weren't our home. But the most revealing discovery was his search history, which he'd forgotten to clear from our shared iPad. Late-night Googling sessions revealed his true priorities. Best divorce attorneys Chicago, prenuptial agreement modifications, how to minimize alimony payments, and most tellingly, quick uncontested divorce timeline. He was researching how to dispose of me as efficiently as possible. The week before my birthday, his excitement became almost manic. He'd hum while shaving, smile at private jokes during dinner, and check his phone with the frequency of a teenager in love. When I asked about his good mood, he'd kiss my forehead and say he was just excited about my party. "This is going to be a night you'll never forget," he'd say, and I believed him completely. The final piece of the puzzle came 3 days before the party, when I overheard him on the phone in his office. I'd brought him coffee, but stopped outside the door when I heard Roxanne's voice through his speaker. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" she was asking. "Excited, not nervous," Damien replied. "This has been months in the planning. Everything's perfectly positioned. She'll never see it coming. And afterward? Afterward, we start our real life together. No more hiding, no more pretending. Just us, exactly as it should have been from the beginning." Their laughter carried through the door as I stood frozen in the hallway, coffee cup trembling in my hands. They weren't just planning to end my marriage, they were celebrating it. This wasn't a difficult decision born from incompatibility. It was a coordinated campaign designed to replace me with minimal disruption to Damien's comfortable life. But as I retreated to the kitchen, setting down the coffee that would remain undelivered, I realized that all their careful planning had given me something invaluable. Time to prepare my own surprise. They thought they knew exactly how tomorrow night would unfold. They had no idea that while they'd been planning my destruction, I'd been planning something far more devastating. Helena's inheritance had just provided me with the perfect weapon, and 3 weeks of observation had shown me exactly when and how to use it. To understand the full scope of what Damien was destroying, you have to understand what we'd built together. 12 years isn't just time, it's shared dreams, accumulated trust, and the 1,000 small intimacies that transform 2 separate lives into one intertwined existence. We met during our second year at Northwestern Law School in Professor Hamilton's constitutional law seminar. I was the scholarship student from Cicero who worked nights at a diner to pay for textbooks. Damien was the golden boy from Lake Forest, whose family had been funding the university library for 3 generations. We shouldn't have had anything in common, but constitutional law has a way of revealing how people think, and I found his mind fascinating. He pursued me with the same methodical persistence he brought to everything else. Flowers on my car windshield, after particularly brutal study sessions. Coffee delivered to the library during my marathon research nights. Study group invitations that somehow always ended with just the 2 of us reviewing cases until dawn. "You see patterns that other people miss," he told me after I'd identified a constitutional precedent that cracked open his mock trial case. "You think like a detective, not just a lawyer. That's rare." I fell in love with his ambition first, then his confidence, and finally his apparent genuine interest in my thoughts and opinions. In a world where I constantly felt like an outsider looking in, Damien made me feel seen, valued, intelligent. When he looked at me, I became the person I'd always wanted to be. The proposal came during our 3rd year, at the same coffee shop where we'd had our first real conversation. No grand gestures or public displays, just the two of us in our usual corner booth, surrounded by case law textbooks and empty coffee cups, planning our future with the same intensity we brought to our studies. "We're good together," he'd said, sliding the ring box across the table. "We balance each other. You ground me, and I can give you the world you deserve." I believed him completely. The ring was perfect, not too flashy, not too modest, exactly what I would have chosen for myself if I'd had the courage to dream that big. When I slipped it on my finger, it felt like signing a contract for the life I'd never dared to imagine. Our early marriage was everything a partnership should be. Damien's family wealth meant I could focus on my career without the financial stress that had defined my entire life until then. I landed a position at a nonprofit legal clinic, working with domestic violence survivors, while Damien joined his father's corporate firm. We were both building something meaningful, supporting each other's ambitions. Helena had been skeptical at first, but even she seemed to warm to me once she saw how I handled myself in their social circles. I studied etiquette books like Case, law, learned wine pairings like legal precedents, and transformed myself into the kind of wife who could support Damien's career advancement. It wasn't deception. It was evolution, or so I thought. The cracks started so slowly I barely noticed them. Damien's suggestion that I leave the nonprofit clinic for a more suitable position at a corporate firm, his gentle corrections of my grammar when we were with his colleagues, the way he'd introduce me by my job title rather than my name, reducing me to my function in his professional narrative. "You're so much smarter than this work," he'd say about my advocacy for abuse survivors. "You could be making real money, building real influence. Why limit yourself to charity cases?" I should have recognized the pattern, the systematic erosion of everything that made me who I was, replaced with a version that better served his ambitions. But love makes you compliant in your own diminishment, especially when it's done with such apparent care and concern. By our 5th anniversary, I'd traded my nonprofit work for a position at a corporate firm that handled white-collar defense. By our 7th, I'd left legal practice entirely to become a full-time corporate wife, managing Damien's social calendar and supporting his advancement. By our 10th, I'd become so thoroughly molded to his specifications that I'd almost forgotten who I'd been before. The transformation had been so gradual, so consistently framed as mutual decision-making, that I'd never questioned whether I was growing into myself or growing away from myself. Damien had convinced me that becoming more like him was the same as becoming my best self. Helena had watched this transformation with apparent approval, but now I wondered if she'd been evaluating something else entirely. Had she seen what I couldn't? That her son was systematically dismantling the woman he'd married, replacing her with a more convenient version? Had she been testing whether I had enough strength left to survive what was coming? The saddest part wasn't that our marriage was ending. It was realizing that it had been ending for years, one small compromise at a time. Damien hadn't fallen out of love with me. He'd simply finished reshaping me into something he could discard without guilt. Roxanne represented everything I'd given up to become his wife. She was still fierce, still independent, still pursuing her passion for photography with the single-minded intensity I'd once brought to legal advocacy. She was the woman I might have remained if I'd chosen differently. But as I stood in our bedroom, looking at the engagement photo on our dresser, young, hopeful faces believing in forever, I realized that Damien had made one crucial error in his assessment. He thought he'd weakened me through transformation. In reality, he'd educated me in strategic thinking, social navigation, and the patience required for long-term planning. The skills he'd insisted I develop to support his career were about to become the tools of his destruction. The universe has a twisted sense of humor, and nowhere was that more evident than in Helena Coleman's final act of maternal judgment. For 12 years, she'd been the ice queen of Lake Forest society, the woman who'd made it clear that her son had married beneath his station. Now, in death, she'd handed me the most devastating weapon imaginable: complete control over everything. Damien believed he was entitled to inherit. Helena's relationship with me had been a complex dance of evaluation and education that I'd never fully understood until now. Those painful Sunday dinners at the family estate, where she'd correct my posture and critique my conversation skills, hadn't been hazing. They'd been training. She was teaching me to navigate their world not to make me worthy of her son, but to determine if I was strong enough to survive him. Money, she'd told me once during a rare private conversation, is only powerful when it's unexpected. Expected inheritance makes men lazy and entitled. Unexpected disinheritance makes them desperate and dangerous. The key is knowing which reaction will serve your purposes better. At the time, I thought she was sharing abstract wisdom about wealth management. Now I realized she'd been giving me the instruction manual for the weapon she was preparing to place in my hands. The irony was exquisite. Damien had spent months positioning himself for a divorce that would leave me financially devastated while preserving his comfortable lifestyle. He'd calculated every asset, planned every move, and built his entire strategy around one fundamental assumption: that he would inherit his mother's estate within the next few years, providing him with the financial cushion to weather any divorce. Settlement. Helena had been ill for the past year, though she'd hidden it with characteristic stoicism. Only her lawyer and closest confidant, Margaret Whitmore, had known the true extent of her condition. The lung cancer that would eventually claim her had been diagnosed 8 months ago, around the same time Damien began his systematic preparation for divorce. But Helena had been making preparations of her own. Your mother-in-law was very specific about her intentions, Margaret had explained during our meeting at her downtown office. She'd been watching your marriage deteriorate for some time. Helena Coleman was many things, but naive wasn't one of them. She knew exactly what her son was planning. The will had been modified 6 months ago, during a period when Damien thought his mother was simply updating routine financial documents. He'd even driven her to the lawyer's office, playing the dutiful son while secretly calculating his inheritance and planning my elimination from his life. Helena had used those car rides to extract information from him. Casual questions about our marriage, gentle probing about his future plans, motherly concern about his happiness. Damien, confident in his manipulative abilities, had revealed more than he realized. She knew about the affair, Margaret continued, sliding a sealed envelope across her mahogany desk. She knew about the divorce planning, and she knew about your sister's involvement. Helena Coleman had spent 60 years managing men who underestimated her intelligence. Her son was just the latest in a long line of such mistakes. The envelope contained Helena's personal letter to me, written in her distinctive script on cream-colored stationery embossed with the Coleman family crest. My dear Delilah, if you're reading this, then my suspicions about my son's character have been confirmed, and you've discovered what I've known for months. Damien has always been brilliant but weak, ambitious but lacking in honor. I had hoped marriage would strengthen him, but instead, it seems to have revealed his fundamental selfishness. You came into our family as an outsider, which gave you perspective the rest of us lacked. You saw us clearly, without the blinding filter of inherited privilege. More importantly, you adapted without losing your essential self, a strength that neither my husband nor my son ever possessed. The inheritance isn't a gift, it's a weapon. Use it wisely. Don't let my son destroy you the way he destroyed every other inconvenient obstacle in his path. You have more intelligence and integrity than anyone in our family has shown in generations. It's time you had the resources to match. Make him understand that some people can't be discarded without consequences. Show him what happens when someone finally fights back with equal resources and superior strategy. With respect and genuine affection, Helena Coleman. The financial documents were staggering. Helena's estate was worth $12 million, accumulated through decades of shrewd investments and careful management. The Lake Forest mansion, the investment portfolio, the family business shares, the art collection, everything Damien had counted on inheriting was now legally mine. But Helena's final masterstroke was the timing. The will wouldn't be read until after the funeral, which was scheduled for 3 days after my birthday party. Damien would attempt to destroy me publicly, believing he had the financial resources to weather any consequences, only to discover afterward that those resources now belonged to his soon-to-be ex-wife. There are conditions, Margaret explained. Helena was very specific about this. If you choose to reconcile with your husband, the inheritance reverts to him. If you divorce him within 1 year of her death, everything remains yours permanently. She's essentially paid you $12 million to leave her son. The conditions revealed Helena's ultimate assessment of our marriage. It was worth more to her to see me escape than to see her family fortune passed down to another generation. Of entitled Coleman men, she'd concluded that the family line was better served by ending with her than by continuing through Damien. But the most devastating detail was the trust fund provision. Damien had been receiving a monthly allowance from his mother's estate for the past 5 years, money he'd assumed would continue indefinitely and had built into his divorce planning. That allowance would terminate immediately upon Helena's death, leaving him financially vulnerable at exactly the moment he'd planned to discard me. Helena had systematically removed every safety net Damien was counting on, while simultaneously providing me with resources he'd never imagined I could access. She'd transformed what should have been my moment of greatest vulnerability into my moment of maximum power. The woman who'd spent 12 years making me feel inadequate had secretly been preparing to make me untouchable. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was validation, revenge, and justice rolled into one perfectly timed gift. Damien thought he was divorcing a financially dependent wife, who would have no choice but to accept whatever terms he offered. Instead, he was about to face a woman with 12 million reasons to fight back and the legal resources to make that fight last as long as necessary. Helena Coleman had given me something more valuable than money. She'd given me the power to ensure that her son's betrayal would cost him everything. Helena's inheritance didn't just give me financial power. It gave me something far more dangerous. Options. For the first time in 12 years, I could choose my own battlefield, set my own timeline, and fight with resources that matched my opponents. But raw power without strategy is just chaos. I needed a plan that would be as methodical and devastating as Damien's betrayal had been. The foundation of any good revenge plot is understanding your target's vulnerabilities, and 12 years of marriage had given me a PhD in Damien Coleman's psychological weak points. His greatest fear wasn't financial loss, it was public humiliation. His entire identity was built on being perceived as successful, sophisticated, and in control. Strip away that image, and he'd crumble like a house of cards. I spent 3 days after Helena's funeral locked in my home office, surrounded by legal pads, laptop screens, and the same methodical planning tools Damien used for his corporate takeovers. If he wanted to treat our divorce like a business transaction, I'd give him the most hostile takeover he'd ever witnessed. The plan needed to accomplish 3 objectives: expose his betrayal publicly, destroy his professional reputation, and leave him financially vulnerable at exactly the moment he thought he was securing his future. But most importantly, it needed to peak at the precise moment he attempted to serve me those divorce papers at my birthday party. Phase 1 would be the financial assault. Margaret Whitmore had already begun the process of reorganizing Helena's estate under my control, but the full impact wouldn't hit until Damien's monthly allowance failed to arrive next week. He'd assume it was an administrative delay, never imagining that his financial foundation had been permanently removed. But I wasn't content to wait for him to discover his vulnerability. Using Helena's inheritance, I could do something far more immediate and devastating. I could buy his debts. Damien's lifestyle exceeded his actual income by a significant margin, subsidized by his mother's allowance and the assumption of future inheritance. He carried substantial credit card debt, had an underwater mortgage on our house, and most critically, owed his law firm nearly $200,000 in partnership buy-in fees that he'd been paying gradually over the past 3 years. Through a series of shell companies established by Margaret's firm, I could purchase those debts at a discount, then accelerate the payment schedules precisely when Damien would be least able to meet them. He'd go from financially stable to desperately overextended within a matter of weeks. Phase 2 targeted his professional reputation. Damien's success as a corporate attorney depended entirely on his image as a stable, trustworthy advisor to high-net-worth clients. His partnership at Coleman, Sterling & Associates was built on his family name and social connections, advantages that would evaporate once his personal life became public scandal. The divorce papers he'd planned to serve at my birthday party would actually work in my favor. A public divorce announcement would open the door for equally public revelations about the circumstances surrounding it. His clients, most of whom were conservative family businesses, would be horrified to learn that their trusted advisor was the kind of man who served divorce papers at his wife's birthday party after conducting an affair with her sister. But the real damage would come from the financial investigation that would inevitably follow. Once Damien's asset hiding came to light during divorce proceedings, his legal license would be in jeopardy. Attorneys who commit fraud in their personal lives rarely maintain their professional standing. Phase 3 was the psychological warfare, the systematic destruction of his assumption that he could control the narrative. Damien's entire plan depended on maintaining his image as the reluctant husband making a difficult but necessary decision. I needed to flip that script completely. The beauty of his birthday party ambush was that it would be public, recorded, and impossible to take back. But what if, instead of being surprised and devastated, I appeared relieved and grateful? What if I thanked him for finally giving me the opportunity to share some news of my own? I began crafting a counter-speech that would turn his moment of triumph into his moment of complete destruction. While he revealed our divorce, I would reveal his affair. While he painted me as inadequate, I would share the financial documents proving his systematic theft from our marriage. And while he tried to control the narrative, I would produce evidence of his forged signatures and fraudulent financial statements. But the masterstroke would be the inheritance revelation. Just as Damien finished explaining why our marriage was over, I would announce that I'd inherited his mother's entire estate, the same estate he was counting on to cushion his post-divorce lifestyle. The timing would be perfect. Public humiliation followed immediately by financial devastation, all witnessed by everyone whose opinion mattered in his professional and social circles. The plan required precise coordination and absolute secrecy. Margaret's law firm would handle the financial maneuvers, ensuring everything was legally bulletproof and properly documented. Jack Morrison, the private investigator, would prepare the affair evidence for maximum impact, and I would practice my own performance until I could deliver devastating revelations with the same calm professionalism Damien brought to his corporate presentations. The final element was the guest list. Damien had invited his law partners, key clients, and influential social contacts to witness what he thought would be my humiliation. Instead, they'd witness his complete destruction. Every person whose respect he valued, every relationship that supported his career, every social connection that reinforced his status would be present for his downfall. But I had one more surprise planned, an invitation Damien didn't know I'd extended. Stephen Morrison, the senior partner at Coleman, Sterling, and Associates and Damien's mentor, would be attending with his wife. Stephen was also the man who controlled Damien's partnership track and had the authority to terminate his employment for moral turpitude. The plan was elegant in its symmetry. Damien had chosen my birthday party as the stage for his betrayal, confident that social pressure would force me to accept his terms gracefully. Instead, he'd created the perfect venue for his own destruction, surrounded by everyone he'd most want to impress and least want to disappoint. By the time the birthday cake was served, Damien Coleman would understand what it felt like to have his entire life systematically dismantled by someone who knew exactly how to push every button, exploit every weakness, and destroy every assumption he'd made about his own untouchability. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and he had no idea the trap was already set. While I methodically prepared for war, Damien floated through his days with the serene confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. His mood had become increasingly buoyant as my birthday approached, and watching him revel in his anticipated victory was like observing a condemned man plan his retirement. The morning routine that had once felt comfortable now carried an undercurrent of dark comedy. Damien would hum while shaving, check his phone with barely contained excitement, and kiss my forehead with the patronizing affection of someone saying goodbye to a pet he was planning to abandon. Every gesture radiated his certainty that he was the chess master, and I was merely a pawn awaiting my inevitable sacrifice. "You seem excited about my party," I'd observe over breakfast, watching him scroll through what I knew were text messages from Roxanne. "I just want everything to be perfect for you," he'd reply, not even bothering to hide his smile. "This is going to be such a memorable night." His arrogance was breathtaking. Damien had become so convinced of his own brilliance that he'd stopped bothering to maintain even basic operational security. He'd leave his laptop open with legal documents visible, take calls with his divorce attorney while I was in the next room, and discuss timeline details with Roxanne at volume levels that suggested he'd forgotten other people existed. The most revealing moment came 3 days before the party, when I overheard him on a conference call with his law partners. They were discussing a client's messy divorce case, and Damien's commentary revealed exactly how he viewed his own situation. "The key," he was explaining, "is maintaining the narrative that you're the reasonable party making difficult but necessary decisions. Never let it become about fault or blame. Focus on incompatibility and mutual benefit. If you control the story, you control the outcome." His colleagues murmured agreement, probably having no idea they were receiving a preview of their partners. Personal strategy. Damien continued with the confidence of a professor lecturing students on a subject he'd mastered. Public announcements work best when they're framed as joint decisions, even when they're not. Social pressure will force the other party to go along rather than cause a scene. Most people will accept almost anything to avoid public confrontation. I stood in the hallway outside his office, coffee cup in hand, listening to him describe the psychological manipulation he planned to use on me as if it were just another legal technique. The clinical detachment in his voice was more chilling than any emotional outburst could have been. His relationship with Roxanne had also lost any pretense of discretion. They'd progressed from careful coordination to open affection, confident that their secret was safe. I'd watch them at family gatherings now, barely bothering to hide their connection. Roxanne would touch his arm during conversations, lean in closer than necessary when he spoke, and laugh at his jokes with the intimate appreciation of someone who'd heard them in much more private settings. The most damning evidence of their overconfidence came when I discovered they'd started apartment hunting together. Damien had left real estate listings open on his laptop, luxury condos in River North, all well beyond what either of them could afford individually, but perfectly reasonable for a successful attorney and his new wife. They'd even begun discussing logistics for after the divorce announcement. I found a note in Damien's handwriting outlining their post-party timeline. D announces at 9 p.m., guests leave by 10:30, R comes over at 11 for comfort and support, spend night together as friends. They were planning to celebrate my destruction in our marital bed within hours of the public announcement. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Damien's behavior was his treatment of me during these final weeks. He'd become almost tender, the way someone might act toward a terminally ill relative. Extra attention, small kindnesses, gentle patience with my questions about the party details. He thought he was being compassionate toward someone whose world was about to end. "You've been so sweet lately," I told him one evening as he massaged my shoulders while I worked on party preparations. "You deserve to be treated well," he replied, and I could hear the guilt in his voice. "You've been a good wife, Delilah. This isn't about you not being enough." The irony was staggering. He was comforting me for the trauma he was planning to inflict, feeling magnanimous about his cruelty because he'd decided it was for my own good. In his mind, he was performing a mercy killing, ending our marriage quickly rather than letting it die slowly. His financial confidence was equally misplaced. Damien had spent the weeks since his mother's funeral making plans that assumed his inheritance was secure. He'd already put a deposit down on the River North condo, scheduled meetings with financial advisors about upcoming liquidity events, and even begun shopping for a new car that would better match his anticipated bachelor lifestyle. The man who'd built his career on due diligence and risk assessment had somehow convinced himself that his mother's estate was a sure thing, despite never having seen her will or spoken to her lawyers about the specifics. His assumptions were built entirely on entitlement and wishful thinking. Meanwhile, Roxanne had begun making her own preparations for their public debut as a couple. She'd booked photography sessions for what she described as portfolio expansion, but which looked suspiciously like engagement photos. She'd started attending social events in their circle, positioning herself as the artistic, sophisticated alternative to the suburban wife role I'd filled. They'd created an entire fantasy future built on the assumption that I would simply disappear from their lives without resistance, leaving behind no complications or consequences. It was the kind of magical thinking that only comes from never having faced real opposition. But the most telling sign of their overconfidence was how they'd begun treating the divorce announcement like a celebration rather than a tragedy. They spoke about finally being free and starting their real life together, with the enthusiasm of people planning a wedding, not the dissolution of a 12-year marriage. Damien had even begun practicing his speech in front of the mirror, perfecting his expression of reluctant resolve. He wanted to appear sad but determined, making a difficult choice for everyone's benefit. He'd rehearsed every pause, every gesture, every moment of eye contact that would sell his performance to our assembled friends and family. What he hadn't prepared for was the possibility that his target might have been preparing a performance of her own. The first domino fell exactly 72 hours before my birthday party, though Damien wouldn't realize its significance for several more days. At 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, while he was in his office preparing for a client meeting, his monthly allowance from Helena's estate failed to transfer to his checking account for the first time in 5 years. I watched from the kitchen window as he took the call from his bank, his confident stride faltering as he paced the length of our driveway. His voice carried through the morning air, growing sharper with each failed explanation the bank representative offered. "There must be some mistake," he insisted. "This transfer has been automatic for years. Check again." But there was no mistake. Helena Coleman's final monthly payment to her son had been made the day before her death. The allowance that had subsidized his lifestyle and formed the foundation of his divorce planning had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Gave him 3 hours to stew before implementing the second phase. At precisely 1 p.m., while Damien was having lunch with a client at his usual downtown restaurant, Marshall and Associates Debt Recovery Services, one of Margaret Whitmore's carefully chosen shell companies, acquired his outstanding credit card. Debt from First National Bank. The beauty of debt purchasing is its opacity. Damien would receive a formal notice in the mail, but he'd assume it was routine paperwork from a bank reorganization. He had no way of knowing that his new creditor was actually controlled by his soon-to-be ex-wife, or that his payment schedule was about to be dramatically accelerated. By 3 p.m., I'd moved to Phase 3. Another shell company, this one called Lakefront Investment Partners, purchased the underwater portion of our mortgage from Chicago Mutual Bank. The transaction was completely legal, properly documented, and virtually untraceable to me personally. Damien now owed money to entities I controlled, though he remained blissfully unaware of this fact. His first sign that something was wrong came at 4:30 p.m., when his assistant buzzed him with an urgent call from Coleman, Sterling and Associates, accounting department. The partnership buy-in payments he'd been making for 3 years had suddenly been called for immediate payment in full. The firm's new financial management company, another of Margaret's acquisitions, had reviewed all outstanding partner obligations and determined that extended payment plans were no longer acceptable. I was in the garden when Damien burst through the back door, his face flushed with confusion and anger. "Did you get any strange calls today?" he demanded. "Bank notices, financial statements, anything unusual?" "No, darling," I replied, not looking up from the roses I was pruning for my birthday centerpieces. "Is everything all right? You look stressed." "It's probably nothing," he said, but I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. "Just some administrative mix-ups with various accounts. I'm sure it'll sort itself out." But it wouldn't sort itself out, and we both knew it. Damien spent the rest of the evening on the phone with banks, lawyers, and financial advisors trying to understand how his carefully constructed financial foundation had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. Each call brought more confusion, more questions, and fewer answers. The timing was exquisite. 48 hours before he planned to destroy my life publicly, his own financial security was crumbling in ways he couldn't understand or control. The psychological pressure was already beginning to show in the tight lines around his eyes and the shortened fuse of his temper. Wednesday brought the second wave of attacks. At 10 a.m., Damien received a certified letter from the Illinois State Bar Association requesting documentation regarding irregularities in personal financial filings that had come to their attention through routine auditing procedures. The irregularities in question were the forged signatures on our financial documents, evidence I'd provided through carefully anonymous channels. By noon, he'd gotten a call from Stephen Morrison requesting an immediate meeting to discuss sensitive partnership matters. Stephen's tone, according to Damien's terse explanation, suggested this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation about his career advancement. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When Damien returned home, he looked like a man who'd aged a decade in a single afternoon. Stephen had presented him with evidence of his affair, photographs Jack Morrison had taken, documented proof of his financial irregularities, and questions about his fitness to represent the firm's family-oriented clientele. "They're not firing me," Damien told me that evening, his voice hollow with shock. "But they're conducting a full investigation. Stephen says if any of this becomes public, my partnership is over." "What kind of investigation?" I asked, pouring him a scotch with steady hands. "What could they possibly be investigating?" "Personal conduct issues," he replied, accepting the drink gratefully. "Apparently someone's been making accusations about my character. Professional ethics violations. They want to review all my personal financial records, marriage documentation, everything." The irony was delicious. Damien had spent months building a case against me, documenting every perceived inadequacy and social misstep. Now he was discovering what it felt like to have his own life dissected by professionals looking for evidence of moral failure. But the real pressure was yet to come. Thursday morning brought news that would shatter his remaining confidence. Helena's will had been read, and he wasn't just losing his allowance. He was losing everything he'd expected to inherit. Margaret Whitmore called him personally. Her voice, professionally neutral as she delivered the devastating news. Helena Coleman had left her entire estate to her daughter-in-law, Delilah Coleman, with specific instructions that her son receive nothing beyond personal mementos of sentimental value only. I watched Damien take the call from across our breakfast, table, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally, dawning horror as he realized the implications. The inheritance he'd counted on to cushion his post-divorce lifestyle belonged to the woman he was planning to discard in 24 hours. "There must be some mistake," he said into the phone, his voice breaking with desperation. "My mother would never. We need to contest this immediately. There has to be grounds for—" But Margaret was thorough in her explanation. The will was ironclad, properly witnessed, and completely legal. Helena had been of sound mind when she'd made her final revisions, and she'd included specific language preventing any challenges to her decision. When Damien hung up, he sat in stunned silence for several minutes. I could practically see him recalculating every assumption he'd made about his future, every plan he'd built on the foundation of inherited wealth. "I'm sorry, darling," I said gently, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "I know how much you expected that inheritance. Your mother must have had her reasons." He looked at me then with something approaching suspicion, but the expression faded quickly. In his mind, I was still the unsophisticated wife who couldn't possibly have orchestrated something this complex. His paranoia focused on external enemies, rival, law firms, vindictive clients, anyone except the woman sitting across from him offering comfort. The final 24 hours before my birthday party would test whether Damien could maintain his composure long enough to execute his plan, or whether the mounting pressure would cause him to crack before he ever got the chance to serve those divorce papers. By Thursday evening, less than 18 hours before my birthday party, Damien's carefully constructed world was unraveling. With accelerating speed, and for the first time, I could see genuine fear creeping into his eyes. The confident predator who'd been stalking toward his prey was beginning to realize he might have walked into a trap instead. The morning had brought another devastating blow. A call from his biggest client, Meridian Holdings, announcing they were reevaluating their legal representation following concerning reports about personal conduct issues. Meridian represented 40% of Damien's billable hours and had been his pathway to senior partnership. Losing them would be catastrophic under normal circumstances. Losing them while facing a bar investigation and partnership review was career suicide. "How did they even know?" Damien muttered, pacing our living room with manic energy. "The bar. Investigation is supposed to be confidential. Stephen swore the partnership review would stay internal. Someone's leaking information deliberately." I looked up from the party preparation checklist I was reviewing, maintaining my expression of supportive concern. Maybe it's just coincidence? You know how conservative those old family businesses can be. Even rumors make them nervous. "There are no coincidences in situations like this," he snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "I'm sorry, babe. I'm just stressed. This timing couldn't be worse. But the timing was perfect, for me." Each revelation hit Damien at precisely the moment when he was least equipped to handle it, creating a cascade of panic that was undermining his ability to think strategically. The master manipulator was discovering what it felt like to lose control of the narrative. His paranoia was escalating by the hour. He'd started checking his phone obsessively, scrutinizing every email and text message for hidden meanings. He'd called Jack Morrison, the private investigator, demanding to know if anyone had been asking questions about him or requesting surveillance. Jack, following my instructions, had played dumb while confirming that yes, several parties had been making inquiries recently. "What kind of inquiries?" Damien had pressed. "Can't say much," Jack had replied with professional discretion. "Client confidentiality, but you might want to be extra careful about your activities for a while. Someone's definitely watching." The psychological warfare was working exactly as intended. Damien was so focused on external threats that he'd never considered the possibility that his enemy was sleeping beside him every night, making coffee for him every morning, and expressing sympathetic concern about his mounting problems. Thursday afternoon brought the piece of evidence that finally shattered his confidence. bank records showing that his credit card debt and mortgage obligations had been sold to collection agencies that were demanding immediate payment. The amounts were staggering, over $300,000 in total, all due within 30 days. "This is impossible," he said, staring at the documents spread across his desk. "You can't just change payment terms like this. There are laws, regulations." "Can't. You fight it legally?" I asked, bringing him coffee and reviewing the papers over his shoulder. "Surely there's some kind of consumer protection." "Not for this kind of debt restructuring," he replied absently, then paused. "Wait, these companies? I've never heard of any of them. Marshall and Associates? Lakefront Investment Partners? They sound like shell companies." For a moment, I saw a flash of the old Damien, the sharp legal mind that had made him so successful. He was beginning to connect dots, recognizing patterns that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. "Someone's targeting me specifically," he said slowly. "This isn't random financial pressure. Someone is systematically attacking my assets, my career, my reputation. Someone with serious resources and legal sophistication." He began making calls, trying to trace the ownership of the companies that now held his debt. But Margaret's firms had been careful. Layers of corporate structure that would take weeks to unravel, if they could be unraveled at all. By evening, Damien's behavior had shifted from confident execution to desperate damage control. He'd spent hours on the phone with his own lawyer, trying to understand his options and build defenses against enemies he couldn't identify. "Maybe we should postpone the party," he said suddenly, looking up from his laptop where he'd been researching corporate investigation firms. "With everything that's happening, this might not be the best time for a big social gathering." The suggestion sent a spike of alarm through me. If Damien canceled the party, he'd deprive me of the perfect stage for his public humiliation. All my careful timing would be wasted. "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "I've been planning this for months. The caterers are confirmed, the decorations are ordered, everyone's expecting to be here. Besides, hiding from problems doesn't make them. Go away. If someone's really targeting you, show them you're not intimidated." Damien studied my face, and for a moment I wondered if he was finally seeing past my performance. But then he nodded, apparently accepting my logic. "You're right," he said. "Running away would just make me look guilty. Better to face whatever's coming head on." But even as he agreed to proceed with the party, I could see him calculating new angles, trying to figure out how to handle his divorce announcement while his life was exploding around him. The confident speech he'd rehearsed was no longer appropriate for a man facing financial ruin and professional destruction. That night, as we lay in bed, I felt Damien staring at the ceiling, his mind churning through possibilities. He was finally beginning to understand that he wasn't in control of this situation, that forces beyond his comprehension were working against him. "Delilah," he said quietly in the darkness, "if something happens tomorrow night, if things get complicated, I want you to know that I never meant for you to get hurt. Whatever happens, this isn't about you being inadequate. You're a good person who deserves better than the mess my life has become." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and it revealed how thoroughly his confidence had been shattered. The man who'd planned to discard me publicly was now worried about protecting me from the consequences of his own choices. "Nothing's going to happen tomorrow night," I assured him, stroking his hair gently. "It's just a party. We'll celebrate with friends, eat too much cake, and everything will work out fine." But as I spoke those comforting lies, I was counting down the hours until Damien would discover exactly what kind of celebration I'd actually planned. Less than 18 hours remained until he learned that his greatest enemy hadn't been some shadowy corporate rival or vindictive client. His greatest enemy had been sleeping beside him all along, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy everything he thought he knew about his own life. Friday morning, my birthday, dawned with the kind of crisp spring clarity that made everything feel sharp and full of possibility. While I prepared breakfast with the serene satisfaction of a conductor about to lead a symphony, Damien sat at the kitchen table surrounded by legal documents, financial statements, and the growing evidence of his systematic destruction. The final wave of attacks had been timed for maximum psychological impact. At 7 a.m., as Damien was reading his morning emails, he received formal notification that the Illinois State Bar Association was accelerating their investigation based on new evidence of potential ethical violations. The hearing that should have taken weeks to schedule was now set for Monday morning. New evidence? Damien muttered, scanning the official letterhead for clues. What new evidence? I haven't done anything different since Tuesday. But I had been busy. Throughout the week, anonymous tips had been flowing to the Bar Association, the IRS, and various regulatory bodies. Each tip was perfectly timed, legally protected, and impossible to trace back to me. Damien's forged signatures, hidden assets, and fraudulent financial documents were being examined by every authority that could make his life miserable. At 8:30 a.m., while Damien was on a frantic call with his attorney, the doorbell rang. I answered it to find a process server with papers that made Damien's face go ashen. A civil lawsuit filed by Coleman, Sterling, and Associates seeking immediate repayment of his partnership buy-in plus interest and penalties, totaling nearly $400,000. They're suing me. Damien stared at the documents in disbelief. My own firm is suing me? Stephen said this was just an internal review. The lawsuit was Margaret's masterstroke. By forcing Damien's firm to take legal action against him, she'd made his professional problems public record. Every legal database in the city would now show that Coleman, Sterling, and Associates considered their own partner a financial liability requiring immediate collection efforts. But the most devastating blow came at 10 a.m., when Roxanne called in tears. She'd been contacted by a photographer claiming to represent Chicago Magazine, asking for an interview about her relationship with prominent attorney Damien Coleman for an upcoming exposé on extramarital affairs in Chicago's legal community. How do they know? Roxanne sobbed into the phone, her voice carrying clearly through Damien's speaker. We've been so careful. Someone must have been watching us, taking pictures. Damien's eyes met mine across the kitchen, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine suspicion. Who else knew about us? He asked Roxanne quietly. Nobody. I swear, nobody. I never told anyone, not even my closest friends. The only person I ever talked to about you was... The pause stretched between them as the implication settled in. Delilah, Roxanne whispered. But she couldn't know. She would have said something, done something. She's not smart enough to orchestrate something like this. I maintained my expression of confused concern, but internally I was savoring the moment. After years of being underestimated by both of them, watching them finally consider my capabilities was deeply satisfying. Delilah doesn't know, Damien said firmly, but his voice lacked conviction. She's been nothing but supportive through all of this. If she knew, she'd be screaming, crying, making scenes. That's not who she is. But doubt had been planted, and I could see it growing behind his eyes. The woman he'd systematically underestimated for 12 years was finally being reconsidered as a potential threat. The afternoon brought a cascade of professional disasters that left Damien reeling. 3 more clients called to terminate their relationships with him, citing reputation concerns and conflict of interest issues. His secretary informed him that reporters had been calling the office asking for statements about ongoing investigations. The parking garage attendant at his building mentioned that several people had been asking questions about his schedule and habits. By 4 p.m., as I was setting up decorations for the party, Damien was a man on the edge of complete breakdown. His financial foundation was gone. His professional reputation was destroyed. His personal life was about to become public scandal, and he still couldn't identify who was responsible for his systematic annihilation. "This is too coordinated to be coincidence," he said, watching me arrange flowers with the focused intensity of someone looking for hidden meanings. "Someone with serious resources and legal expertise has been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Someone who knows my vulnerabilities, my schedule, my relationships." He was circling closer to the truth, but his own arrogance continued to blind him. The idea that his unsophisticated wife could be capable of such complex orchestration remained beyond his ability to accept. The final test of his suspicions came at 5 p.m., when I suggested he might want to cancel his birthday speech. "You seem so stressed," I said, adjusting his tie with wifely concern. "Maybe tonight should just be about celebrating, not making announcements. Whatever you were planning to share can wait until things settle down." Damien studied my face with laser focus. "What makes you think I was planning to make an announcement?" "You've been practicing something in your office?" I replied innocently. "I assumed it was a birthday toast or something sweet, but if you're not feeling up to public speaking..." For a moment, I thought he might finally see through my performance. His eyes narrowed as he processed my words, looking for evidence of knowledge I shouldn't possess. But then his phone rang with another crisis, this time a call from the IRS requesting documentation for an audit. And the moment passed. Whatever. Suspicions he might have harbored were swept away by the immediate need to handle the latest disaster. As guests began arriving for the party, Damien was a shadow of the confident man who'd planned to destroy me just hours earlier. His hands shook as he greeted friends. His smile never quite reached his eyes, and his conversation was distracted by the constant buzz of his phone bringing new catastrophes. The predator had become the prey, and he still didn't understand that. His hunter had been living in his house all along, learning his patterns, studying his weaknesses, and preparing for this moment with the patience of someone who'd been systematically underestimated for far too long. The party was about to begin, and Damien Coleman was about to discover that some surprises cut far deeper than divorce papers ever could. As the first guests arrived at 7 p.m., our house transformed into a stage set for the most important performance of my life. Every detail had been choreographed with the precision of a military operation. The lighting that would ensure every face was clearly visible when the revelations began, the positioning of chairs that would make escape impossible for key witnesses, and the timing of dinner service that would guarantee everyone was present for the main event. Stephen Morrison arrived precisely on schedule, his wife Harriet on his arm, both dressed with the understated elegance that marked them as the evening's most important audience members. Stephen's presence alone would ensure that whatever happened tonight would be reported back to every partner at Coleman, Sterling & Associates by Monday morning. I watched Damien greet his mentor with desperate enthusiasm, trying to project normalcy, while his world crumbled around him. Stephen's responses were politely distant, the kind of careful neutrality that spoke volumes about Damien's current standing at the firm. "Delilah, you look radiant," Harriet said, kissing my cheek with genuine warmth. "40 suits you beautifully. You must be so excited about whatever surprise Damien has planned." "Oh, I think everyone will be surprised tonight," I replied, my smile never wavering. Damien's been so secretive about his plans. Roxanne arrived fashionably late, as always, but her usual confidence was notably absent. The photography equipment she typically carried was nowhere to be seen, and her dress, while stunning, seemed chosen more for easy escape than maximum impact. The woman who'd spent months planning to celebrate my destruction looked like someone walking into her own execution. She embraced me with sisterly affection that now felt grotesque, her perfume the same scent I'd detected on Damien's shirts for months. "Happy birthday, Dee," she whispered. "I hope tonight brings you everything you deserve." "I'm counting on it," I replied, holding her gaze just long enough to plant a seed of uncertainty. As the evening progressed, I moved through the crowd, with practiced grace, ensuring each guest felt welcomed and valued. These people, our friends, our colleagues, our social circle, had no idea they were about to witness the complete destruction of a marriage and career. They'd come expecting celebration and would leave with enough gossip to fuel conversations. For years. Margaret Whitmore arrived at 8:30, ostensibly as a family friend paying respects to Helena's memory, but actually as my insurance policy. If Damien somehow managed to spin tonight's events in his favor, Margaret would be present to provide legal clarification about exactly who now controlled the Coleman family fortune. By 8:45, all the players were in position. Damien stood near the fireplace, the divorce papers hidden in his jacket pocket, checking his watch with increasing frequency. He'd managed to compose himself enough to play the gracious host, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the forced quality of his laughter, the way his eyes kept finding exits as if calculating escape routes. The moment of truth was approaching, and neither of us could delay it any longer. At 9 p.m., exactly according to his original timeline, Damien would attempt to destroy my life in front of everyone we knew. But tonight, the only life being destroyed would be his own. At precisely 9 p.m., as the birthday cake was being served and our living room filled with the warm chatter of celebration, Damien stood up. The sound of his spoon against his wine glass cut through the conversation like a blade, commanding attention with the authority he'd spent years cultivating. This was the moment he'd rehearsed for weeks, the performance that would destroy my life while maintaining his reputation as the reluctant but reasonable husband. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a closing argument, "I'd like to say a few words about my beautiful wife on this special evening." The room fell silent, 38 faces turning toward him with expectant smiles. I watched each expression with perfect clarity, knowing I was about to witness the last moments of their innocent assumption that this was simply a birthday celebration. Roxanne stood near the back wall, her knuckles white as she gripped her wine glass, the woman who thought she was about to watch her rival's public humiliation. Stephen Morrison leaned forward with professional interest, unaware he was about to witness his partner's complete destruction. Margaret Whitmore watched with the calm attention of someone who knew exactly what was coming, and what was coming next. "Delilah and I have shared 12 wonderful years together," Damien continued, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket where the divorce papers waited like a loaded weapon. "We've grown as individuals, supported each other's dreams, and built something meaningful. But sometimes, when you truly love someone, you have to make the most difficult decisions for their happiness and growth." I could see the words forming on his lips, the carefully rehearsed speech about mutual respect, amicable separation, and new beginnings. The same speech he'd practiced in front of our bedroom mirror, perfecting each pause and gesture for maximum emotional impact. This was the moment he'd planned for months, the public execution disguised as magnanimous sacrifice, the systematic destruction of my life wrapped in noble rhetoric. But before he could deliver the killing blow, I stood up. "Thank you, darling," I said, my voice cutting through his momentum like scissors through silk. "Actually, I have a few things to share with everyone too. What absolutely perfect timing." Damien's eyes widened in confusion, his prepared speech derailing as I moved to stand beside him at the center of the room. The divorce papers remained half-pulled from his pocket, suddenly irrelevant in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Our guests shifted forward in their chairs, sensing that the evening had taken an unexpected turn. "You see," I continued, turning to address our assembled friends and colleagues with the same composed confidence Damien had always envied in courtroom settings. "This week has been absolutely full of surprises. Damien's been planning his special announcement, and I've been planning mine. It's almost like we can read each other's minds after all these years." I reached into my purse and withdrew a manila envelope. Not divorce papers, but something far more devastating. The legal documents that would transform this celebration into Damien's public execution. 3 days ago, I inherited Helena Coleman's entire estate, I announced, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. $12 million, plus properties, real estate investments, and controlling interests in several family businesses. Everything that Damien expected to receive from his dear mother has been left entirely to me. The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps rippled through the room like shockwaves as the implications hit our guests with devastating clarity. Stephen Morrison's wine glass froze halfway to his lips. Harriet's hand flew to her chest in surprise. Several guests began whispering frantically to their spouses, calculating what this meant for the divorce announcement they'd all been expecting. Damien's face went from confused to horrified as he realized his financial safety net hadn't just disappeared. It now belonged to the woman he was planning to destroy. The inheritance he'd counted on to cushion his bachelor lifestyle, to fund his new life with Roxanne, to provide the security that made his betrayal feel risk-free, was now controlled by his intended victim. But that's not all, I continued, pulling out a second set of documents with theatrical precision. I also have some fascinating financial records showing how my husband has been systematically stealing from our joint accounts for months, forging my signature on legal documents, moving assets to hidden accounts, and preparing to leave me completely destitute while he starts his exciting new life. The silence in the room was now deafening, broken only by the sound of someone's wine glass hitting the floor. Damien's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain struggling to process how completely his plan had been reversed. With my sister, I finished, my eyes finding Roxanne across the room like a laser targeting. It's Mark, my own beloved sister, who's been helping him plan my destruction for months while pretending to care about my marriage, my happiness, and my well-being. Roxanne's face went ashen as every head in the room turned toward her. The glass in her hand shattered against the wall as she stepped backward, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "So yes, darling husband," I said, turning back to Damien with a smile that could have cut through steel. "Let's absolutely talk about difficult decisions and new beginnings. But first, why don't you tell everyone about those papers in your pocket? The divorce documents you were planning to serve at my birthday party like some kind of twisted gift? Go ahead, Damien. Show them what you prepared for our friends to witness." Damien stood frozen, trapped between his abandoned plan and a reality he'd never imagined possible. The divorce papers felt like acid in his pocket as 38 pairs of eyes waited for his response. The hunter had become the hunted, the prosecutor had become the defendant, and the entire social circle he'd planned to use as witnesses to my humiliation was now witnessing his complete and total destruction. The woman he'd systematically underestimated for 12 years had just demonstrated exactly what happened when superior strategy met perfect timing, and the birthday party was just getting started. The aftermath of that birthday party became the stuff of Chicago society legend. Within hours, every major law firm in the city knew that Damien Coleman had been caught stealing from his wife, forging documents, and planning to serve divorce papers at her birthday celebration. By Monday morning, his legal career was effectively over. Stephen Morrison's reaction was swift and decisive. Coleman, Sterling and Associates terminated Damien's partnership that weekend, citing conduct incompatible with the firm's ethical standards. The Illinois State Bar Association accelerated their investigation, ultimately suspending his license pending a full ethics review that would take years to complete. Roxanne disappeared from Chicago entirely, her photography studio closed, and her apartment abandoned within a week. I heard through family channels that she'd moved to Portland, starting over with a new identity and a new career, far from the scandal she'd helped create. She never contacted me again, and I never bothered to track her down. Some betrayals are so complete that revenge becomes redundant. The divorce proceedings were remarkably swift given the circumstances. With Helena's inheritance securing my financial independence and Margaret Whitmore representing my interests, Damien had no leverage to negotiate. He signed whatever papers were placed in front of him, eager to escape with whatever dignity remained. The house on Lakeshore Drive became mine, along with most of our shared assets. Damien moved into a studio apartment in Lincoln Park, supported by odd jobs and contract work when firms occasionally needed his expertise without wanting his name on their letterhead. The man who'd planned to discard me for limiting his ambitions had ultimately limited himself beyond recovery. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was professional. With Helena's inheritance providing seed money, I returned to legal practice, founding a firm specializing in divorce cases involving financial fraud and domestic deception. My first client was a woman whose husband had been hiding assets in offshore accounts. My second was a man whose wife had been systematically stealing from their joint business. Word spread quickly through Chicago's legal community about the attorney, who'd taken down one of the city's most respected practitioners using nothing but patience, planning, and superior strategy. My client list grew to include politicians, business leaders, and celebrities who needed someone capable of fighting at the highest levels of legal warfare. Margaret Whitmore became my mentor and eventually my partner. Helena would be proud. She told me during our first official meeting as business partners. She always said the Coleman family needed new blood. She just never expected it to come through replacement rather than evolution. 6 months after my 40th birthday, I attended a charity gala downtown. Damien was there, working as a server for the catering company, his once expensive suit replaced by a black vest and bow tie. Our eyes met across the ballroom, and for a moment, I saw recognition, regret, and something that might have been respect. He'd learned finally what happened when someone underestimated the wrong person. And I'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't just surviving betrayal, it's transforming it into the foundation for something far better than what was destroyed. The birthday girl had gotten everything she deserved, exactly as promised. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.